Just when we're looking at our timber frame, before you install all the membrane and cut it and try to install it, you just want to measure and plan out where you may have your penetrations and how big you need to cut your tapes and your membranes. Ideally, we want to work in manageable lengths, in lengths of membrane about 2 to 3 meters, and lengths of tape in arm width lengths of tape. So in this case here, we know that our timber frame are around 600 centers, 600 millimeters between the timber studs. So we have 600, 1200, 1800, and we also want to have a bit of lap either side, ideally about 100 mil either side. So we know that we'll cut this piece of membrane about 2 meters, and it will have adequately wide strips either side that we can seal the membrane back to the adjacent air barrier. Within the markings of the membrane, we have the markings at 100 millimeter centers. So 100 millimeters, 200, 300, and then we had 500 millimeters, 5, 1 meter, 1.5, and then 2 meters. Ilias can come ahead and mark down 2 meters and cut down with the membrane. Ideally, we want to use as much as possible the right tool, so using a long blade to rip through the membrane. The membrane has reinforcement in it, so yeah, avoid using blunt knives. You'll get very, very frustrated if you're doing that. The membrane is 1.5 by 50 meters in length, so we know, as I mentioned, we want to always give ourselves some tolerance at the edges and some overlap at the edges. So we know that we have 1.5, we want to allow for at least 50 millimeters on the adjacent substrate to seal to. So we've marked up 1.45 on our timber studs, where Ilias can put his first staple to temporarily fix it. What this does then, it gives Ilias at least 15 millimeters of material to seal at the bottom of the wall. So then we can pull out the membrane and then temporarily fix it here. So we'll miss a stud and we'll hit this stud here and we'll pin it again. So as you want to put a pull on the membrane, but don't to make it over taut. We just want to have it nice and tight. And when you're working on your own, especially, what is helpful is to apply the first staples here, miss a stud, apply the next staples here to keep your line straight, and then come down into the middle. What you're doing here is you're creating kind of a V form. So especially when you're working on your own, when you have this V form, to apply staples at the top, miss the middle stud, and come down into the middle and apply your staples at the bottom. What this does, it just makes sure that, especially if you're working on your own, as I said, that you keep things nice and taut, and then you come back in and you can fill in the staples where you first apply them. So Ilias will then go down to the bottom of the first hand side stud and apply some staples there, and then you can infill the staples in between the first and the second stud. So what you'll notice here is, even though we've created this V form here, you'll see the membrane is bulging. So this is very common. What we'll see is when we are running services and pipes through the air barrier is these need to be taken care of. So at this instance, it's the best time to create a hole for your service. In this case, it's a 4-inch 100 millimeter duct around which Ilias will make a hole and then fully press the air barrier back in against the timber frame. Again, here he has a multiple 3 cables coming through the air barrier, so he'll just make some nicks with the blade and then push the membrane back. It doesn't matter at this stage is about the holes around the cables. We'll come back and we'll seal them. So you just want to give yourself adequate play around the cables and the pipes to seal around. And in this case here, we have another pipe here. That's fine. So yeah, you'll get a general sense that that's what you're looking for, and then we can come back in and we can staple and make it more taut. But yeah, we've allowed for these rather than hiding the services and the pipes behind your air barrier, and then at a later stage someone has to go looking for them and making bigger and unnecessary holes. What you'll find is when you allow for some pipes and cables coming through your air barrier, what you find sometimes is you may need to reposition your membrane. The beauty of it when you use it, this instance here, when you locate the majority of your staples in this area here, it's going to be overlapped with the next membrane. So what you can do is you can be quite liberal in the amount of staples you put in this first section, and it can be removed because they'll always be over taped at a later stage. So Ilias is going to reposition the membrane. Just make sure that it's fully taut this time. And you can see there already that you're getting a much tighter taut membrane. And now he can infill in between the surfaces. So ideally when we're applying the membrane, we're always following the direction of the stud. So in this case we have vertical timber studs. So we're applying the staples at roughly 100 millimeter centers between staples in the direction of the stud. Again here at 100 millimeter centers. So again, like the markings on the top of the membrane also has these markings at every 100 millimeters. So which donates 100 millimeters to where you can apply your staples. This works really well when you have fibrous insulation behind your air barrier. You may need to reduce the centers of your studs, and one such case is when you're applying, say, dense pack cellulose, or pumped in cellulose, or a dense pack wood fiber like Gutex thermofiber. In this case, you'd reduce your staples down to about 50 millimeter centers. There's going to be much more pressure against the membrane when you use a dense pack insulation, whereas in this case here, you can apply them at 100 millimeter centers. So, yeah, so now Ilias has done that, he can come ahead and he has one more cable to seal. Yeah, you'll see here when you're using a fibrous insulation, you will have a general bulging of the membrane. Ideally, that's what we're looking for, in that we don't want a gap between our air barrier and our insulation. Ideally, when we start the design, we show a full fill of insulation in between our timber frame, our studs or our rafters, and we have a continuous layer of air barrier on the inside. So the two ideally should always be in full contact with each other. For timber frame, ideally the staples we're using are 8 millimeters deep by 10 millimeters wide. Yeah, the benefit of using those 8 millimeter deep and 10 millimeter wide staples is that they allow for some play in the membrane rather than using tacks or thinner staples that are going to put more pressure on the membrane. They take some movement in the long term. Yeah, there has to be galvanized and rust resistant. So you'll see there, just as we've started, it's looking pretty taut. Now Ilias will come back and fill in more staples on the stud. Yep. So that's it pretty taut. Now we'll have a look at the next section to take care of. We'll be putting on the next layer of membrane above that, and we're sealing the overlap. We'll have a look at that detail. Okay, so now that we've applied the first layer of membrane, we've just went ahead and we've cut the same length of membrane, 2 meters again, to apply above this. So again, we're working from floor to ceiling. So we've cut a 2 meter length, and we'll apply it at the base. So you'll see, as we mentioned before, about the markings on the membrane. This time here we're 100 millimeters down, and this gives us a good guide to work off. That we're applying the bottom of the membrane to this line here, which is 100 millimeters overlap between membranes. So as before, when Ilias puts, he can be quite liberal in the amount of staples he puts in the first section here, this first overlapping section. He knows that's always going to be covered with an overlapping tape. So he can take out the staples and reposition if he needs to, because that any penetration will be covered with the overlapping tape. So as before, we've missed the stud. We've applied the membrane. Again, just going off this line all the time. And then Ilias will come up to the top. He'll apply a staple temporarily. And then he'll come into the middle and he'll apply another staple. Again, to get our V shape, as we talked about before. Okay, so now that Ilias has temporarily put the membrane in place, you see, similar to the first section here where we do have some penetrations through the membrane, you'll see some bulging. So in this case here, we have a penetrating timber joist. This needs to be sealed around.